Hello viewers, today we will be discussing the topic Federalism and the Identity of States in India. In order to facilitate better understanding of this topic, the entire discussion has been divided into a number of segments. We would first start with the concept of federalism, then we would move on to the features of federalism, and then the Indian Constitution and the enumeration of federal features. After that, the second part of the discussion would focus on the position of the states in the Indian federal system. We would start off that discussion with the Constituent Assembly debates, and then we would move on to constitutional provisions as well as Supreme Court judgments on the position of Indian states. Now students, governments across the world can be divided on the basis of the type of government in terms of whether they derive their powers from the people, or dictatorial governments in terms of democracy as deriving their powers from the government. We can also have governments based on the number of governments that they have and the type of governments. Depending on the number of governments, we have unitary states where we have one central government having its power over the entire country. On the other hand, we also have federations where there is a central government and many states or provincial governments. India is a classic example of a federation where we have a central government and several state governments besides having local governments also. Now, in order to understand what is a federation, we need to understand and conceptualize that federalism is a type of government wherein the powers of the central and regional governments are separate, and the regional governments enjoy coordinate powers with the central government. Essentially, classic federations like the American Federation, Canadian Federation, Australian Federation are all examples of dual governments. Now, in Switzerland, Canada, Australia, America, you will find that federations display certain characteristics. For example, dual system of government, there is a central government and state governments. There is distribution of powers between the central and the state governments. There is a written constitution which is rigid. The constitution is considered to be supreme, and finally there is a Supreme Court to decide on conflicts between the center and the states. Do we have these features in India? Yes, students. If you look into the Indian Constitution, you will find that federal features are there in the Indian Constitution. We have a dual system of government in the sense that there is a union government and many state governments. We also have distribution of powers between the central and the state governments. The distribution of powers are contained in the 7th schedule of the Constitution, which provides for union list, state list and concurrent list, where the union and the states can jointly make laws. Thirdly, we also have a written constitution. The supremacy of the constitution has been well established, and the constitution clearly provides for the do's and don'ts for the government. Finally, we have a Supreme Court in order to resolve conflicts that may arise between the center and the states or between the different states. Let us now come to the regional governments and the states and their position within the Indian federal system. Now, federalism is generally considered to be a type of self-rule and shared rule. Now, when we speak of shared rule, it is enigmatic to understand that there are certain areas where the center will make rules, there are certain areas where the states will make rules. However, there are some areas where both of them would be jointly making laws and regulations for better governance of the country. Now, if you look into the distribution of powers in the Constitution, you will find that there is a clear-cut demarcation of powers between the central government located at New Delhi and the various state governments. Not only that, you will also find that there is some kind of separation of powers in the sense that the union list consists of exclusive powers where the union government can only make laws. However, subjects or areas not mentioned in any of the three lists belongs to the union government to make laws. Now, how did federalism originate in India? We have already studied that federalism is an imposition of the colonial rule, wherein the Government of India Act 1935 provided for a diarchy and dual system of government. However, please note that Government of India Act 1935 provided for administrative decentralization insofar as provinces were given certain powers. But if you also need to understand that the Government of India Act 1935 provided for diarchy and distribution of powers for the 11 provinces which were directly ruled by the British government. However, we also need to understand that the constitution of these 11 British ruled provinces being highly heterogeneous in nature, the scheme of things were very, very complicated. And we also need to understand that the British government introduced diarchy purely for administrative convenience, and the states were also not very conscious about their identities. Though we should also not forget the fact that during the time when the Government of India Act 1935 was promulgated, we already had linguistic movements being carried out in different parts of the country. However, we also need to contrast here the US federal system, where the units were highly conscious of their identity and they have formed the union and they participated in the federal system with their consent and through their direct iteration of their powers. Now, one important thing to note is that so far as the identity of states in India is concerned, the Constituent Assembly of India does not provide for major discussions on state autonomy. However, this does not mean that there were no discussions at all so far as provincial autonomy were concerned. Now, before we move on to the Constituent Assembly debates in India, and how did the states fare in this debate, it is imperative to understand the position of the states in the classic American federal system. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution of America provides that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Thus, it clearly states that the federal government only has those powers delegated to it by the Constitution. If the powers are not listed in the Constitution and given by the Constitution to the American Union, it belongs to the states or to the people. Thus, we find there's a clear-cut demarcation of powers and responsibilities between the federal government in America and the respective state governments. Now, what about state rights, and what did the Constituent Assembly debates provide for that? Now, the Constituent Assembly debates did not witness any deep-seated conflict of interest. On the contrary, there was a virtual absence of conflict between the centralists and the provincialists within the Constituent Assembly debates. Interestingly enough, the provincialists within the Constituent Assembly demanded increased revenue for the provinces, but agreed that the union should collect the money and then distribute it among the units. This said Granville Austin, that the Indian Constitution can hardly be considered to be a traditional defense of provincial autonomy. Now, although there was no organized states' rights group in the Constituent Assembly, yet deliberations took place on the relationship between the center and the units. The issue of state autonomy was broadly divided into 4 categories of members. The first category included the champions of state autonomy. The second category included Gandhians who believed in decentralization and rural self-government. And third group consists of the Muslims, and the last group consists of the centralists. Interestingly, Somnath Lahiri, one of the representatives of the CPI, argued in favor of right of secession of the constituent units based on the Soviet model, but the proposal did not find many takers within the assembly. A minuscule of Muslim League representatives such as Muhammad Ismail and B. Pokar Sahib expressed the need for provincial autonomy to prevent totalitarianism of the center. They believed that provincial autonomy would give more powers to the Muslim community. Gandhians, however, advocated decentralization, and they believed that rural autonomy can only be brought about by giving more powers to the states, and they believed that that would be the reflection of true democracy in India. Now, though the issue of state rights in the Constituent Assembly was secondary and the provincial loyalists were muted, was proof of the fact that the provinces were highly heterogeneous in complexion. However, there was a great deal of sentiment in favor of administrative decentralization, which was advocated by the provincialists who argued in favor for more and better decentralization of the provinces so far as administration is concerned. But please remember, students, that as a group, provincialists did not argue for complete state autonomy. This was the case of directly ruled British provinces. Now let us try to understand what about the princely states. What did they ask for so far as autonomy of these princely states were concerned? Now the problem with the princely states was of a different magnitude altogether. They were unwilling partners in the proposed federation. In fact, they were not willing to part off with their autonomy and their so-called internal sovereignty for the sake of joining the Indian Federation. The proof of this is the Round Table Conferences in London for the reforms of the 1935 Act. Now, we need to understand that the Maharaja of Bikaner, who broadly represented the views of the princely states in London, had put forth a number of arguments whereby they believed that the state should be left independent. On 1st December 1930, he clearly stated that our willingness to consider federation is subject to two essential and broad conditions. And here I quote the Maharaja of Bikaner. He states that India retains the British connection as an equal partner in the British Commonwealth of Nations and that an equitable agreement is reached between all the parties concerned to govern relations of two Indias, ensuring for the states their due position in the future constitution as co-equal partners with British India, guaranteeing their treaties and internal sovereignty, and safeguarding their interests, including those of their subjects. Thus, it was very clear from the statement of the Maharaja of Bikaner that they were unwilling to be constituent units of the Indian Federation. Rather, they were willing to maintain their internal sovereignty as under the British administrative system. Now, detailed provisions took place within the Constituent Assembly on what word should be used. Should we use the term states for the Indian units, Pradesh, or we can go in for certain other terminologies. Please remember, students, that in different federations, different words are used for the units. For example, in Switzerland, the units are called cantons. In America, the units are called states. Now, members refused to define the units in the American sense. They were not willing to give the units the range of autonomy enjoyed by the American states. For example, two eminent members of the Constituent Assembly, that is G.S. Gupta and L.K. Moitro, were critical of the use of the expression states to describe the federal units of India. They contended that the use of the term states may give rise to controversies in future as the idea of state implied sovereignty and supremacy. The states may demand absolute sovereignty in the near future. Now let us come to another interesting part of the discussion. State boundaries and the consent of states in the formation of new states. And another part of the ensuing discussion with what does the Supreme Court have to say on the autonomy of the states or reorganization of states. So here our discussion would focus on two important areas. Number one, Article 3 of the Indian Constitution, and number 2, states' representation in the Rajya Sabha. Let us start off with Article 3 of the Indian Constitution, which will be followed by a discussion of Supreme Court judgments about whether the state should have complete autonomy to decide for themselves, or rather the union can have unilateral power over the states. As we have already studied, students, that America is considered to be a classic federation which is based on the principle of indestructible union of indestructible states. Whereas, students, so far as Indian federal system is concerned, we call it to be an indestructible union of destructible states. Now, with this background, we need to understand that Article 3 gives Parliament the power to reorganize internal state boundaries. Now, we also need to understand that this reorganization may imply increase in the state boundaries, decrease in boundaries of state, formation of new states, uniting two or more states, or dividing states into a number of units. Now, so far as parent states are concerned, when the question of reorganizing their territories come in, is their consent important? Now, if you read Article 3, it says that the President can reserve the bill for consideration of the states for their consultation. Now, please remember, students, consultation is not equivalent to consent. The states can be consulted, but the consent of the state is not important. The states may give their consent, may not give their consent, but the Parliament can override the approval or disapproval of the states and carry on reorganization of the provinces. Here it is imperative to understand that the states are not as powerful as the American federal system. So the boundaries of the internal boundaries of the states can be configured by the union government as and when required. Thus, Article 3 gives powers to the Union Parliament to consult the states, but consultation does not mean consent. Now, this particular observation was referred to the Supreme Court in a number of cases. Let us take up 3 such cases and the observations of the Supreme Court about the consent of the states. The first case, which is of extreme significance, is the Babulal Parathe versus State of Bombay 1960. This particular case tried to observe the extent of Article 3 of the Constitution. The appellant argued that the State of Bombay, under States Reorganization Act, was a single unit instead of 3 units proposed in the original bill, and this was in contravention of Article 3 of the Constitution, since the legislature of Bombay had no opportunity to express its views on the amendments made in the Parliament to the bill. Now, the Supreme Court held that, number 1, the state legislature have a right under Article 3 only to express their views, not to make modifications. And number 2, the bill in the proviso to Article 3 does not include amendments of any of the clauses of the bill. Therefore, the Parliament was absolutely right in going ahead with bifurcation of Bombay into Maharashtra and Gujarat. The second case which happened was in 2009. The case was titled as Pradeep Chaudhary versus Union of India 2000. In this case, the constitutionality of Section 3 of the Uttar Pradesh Reorganization Act 2000, which included Haridwar district in the state of Uttarakhand, became an important issue. The original bill for reorganization of Uttar Pradesh placed before the state assembly only the city of Haridwar as being a part of the territory of Uttaranchal. However, when the amended version came, it included the whole district of Haridwar inclusive of the city of Haridwar. Now, citing Babulal Parathe with approval, the court reiterated that while ascertaining the views of the state legislature under the proviso to Article 3 was mandatory, but Parliament was in no way bound by these views. So, if the Parliament had included the entire district of Haridwar in the new bill, the old consent of Uttar Pradesh Assembly did not work here. Therefore, Article 3 was paramount so far as states reorganization was concerned. There was another very interesting case which was called the Mangal Singh versus Union of India, which goes back to 1967. The interpretation of parliamentary supremacy was extended to Article 4. In this particular case, the appellants contended that the Punjab Reorganization Act of 1966 violated the mandatory provisions of Article 170 Clause 1 by departing from the minimum prescribed membership of the State Legislative Assembly. The court, however, held that the power to reduce the total number of members of the assembly below the number prescribed by Article 170 Clause 1 was implicit in the authority to make laws under Article 4. According to the court, the scope of the phrase supplemental, incidental, or consequential in Article 4 was not just restricted to the amendment of the first and the fourth schedules of the Indian Constitution, but also to the admission, establishment, or formation of a state to conform to the democratic pattern envisaged by the Constitution. Thus, post Mangal Singh, we can see that the only requirement is that the new state must have an effective legislature, executive and judicial organs, as the Constitution requires this for every state. So, the concept of minimum requirements for the members of Legislative Assembly, the number of members in the Legislative Assembly, was done away with. Another very important, interesting area is the representation of the states in the parliament. Generally, we know that the Rajya Sabha, which is also called the Council of States, consists of representatives from all the states of the Indian Union. Now, students, we have already studied that so far as the American federal system is concerned, the Senate is the upper chamber there, and the Senate is the representative body of the states of the American units. Now, the Senate consists of 100 members. 2 members is elected from each state. There are 50 states in America. 2 into 50 is equal to 100 senators in the Senate. So, in America, we find that the 50 states are equally represented in the American Congress. This equality of states' representation is conspicuously absent in the Indian Parliament's upper house. Now, let us try to see what is the position in India. Section 3 of the Representation of Peoples Act 1951 originally provided that qualification for a Rajya Sabha candidate is that he should be an elector in the parliamentary constituency of the state from which he has been elected. That means a Rajya Sabha representative should have a place of residence from the state from which he has been elected. Now, this particular section was amended by the Constitution Amendment Act of 2003. Now, this particular Act of 2003, what did it do? It replaced the word state and included India. That means today it is not important for a representative of the Rajya Sabha to belong to a particular state which he represents in the Rajya Sabha. In simpler terms, a representative of the state of West Bengal in the Rajya Sabha may not belong from West Bengal itself. He may be from any other state. And that does not prevent him from participation in elections to the Rajya Sabha. Does this mean that the position of the states have been weakened in the Rajya Sabha? Now, that particular amendment was challenged in Kuldeep Nair versus Union of India 2006, which contended that this particular provision violated the principles of federalism. If a representative is not representing the state in the Rajya Sabha, then what happens to state's representation in the upper chamber? Now, a representative with no domicile is not a representative of the state. The representative must have an identifiable nexus with the state. It obliterated the different qualifications required for Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, as was the objective of the Constituent Assembly. A Lok Sabha member can be elected from any state, but the Rajya Sabha previous to the 2003 amendment had to be elected from the state from which he was representing. Now, this entire difference between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha representation has been obliterated under the amendment of 2003. Now, this violation of Article 84, which requires Parliament to prescribe by legislation some connection between the representative and his state. Now, the petitioners further contended that the Parliament has abdicated its responsibility under Article 84C. So, how will Rajya Sabha MPs represent their states if they are not from the states themselves? Now, what did the Supreme Court say in this particular case? Chief Justice Sabharwal refuted the arguments and maintained that the chief mark of federalism is the partition of legislative and executive authority of the center and the units by the Constitution. The principle of federalism in India is not territorially located. India is in sharp contrast with many other federations, therefore there is no requirement to kind of compare Indian federal system and states representation in the upper chamber with that of the American federal system. In USA and Canada, residence requirements clearly mentioned in their respective constitutions for Senate membership. And finally, residential requirement is not a constitutional requirement in India for Rajya Sabha because the constitution does not mention it. Now, this seems to have weakened the position of states in the upper chamber of the Indian legislature. Now, apart from these two major areas, Article 3 and representation of states in the Rajya Sabha, there are certain other peculiarities which can be observed in the Indian federal system, which seems to weaken the position of states in India. Number one, as we have already studied, no equality of states representation in the Rajya Sabha. Thus, the membership may vary from 1 to 31. Again, another important peculiarity that we can see is that Parliament has authority over state list items also. Article 249 of the Indian Constitution says that if the Rajya Sabha passes a resolution by two-thirds majority that a particular subject of the state list has acquired national importance, then the Parliament will have power to legislate on matters of state list also. Therefore, state lists can also come under the control of the Parliament. So far as concurrent subjects are concerned, though the Constitution provides for the Parliament and the states to have concurrent jurisdiction, yet if there is a conflict between a Parliament law and a state law on concurrent jurisdiction, the Parliament law shall prevail. This, however, shows that the Parliament supremacy has been well established. This is not only during normal times but also during times of emergency, where we know that during the imposition of a state emergency or national emergency, the powers of the state legislatures are seriously curtailed. What can we deduce from today's observations, students? We can summarize our entire discussion from two observations. Number one, the fact that the Constitution tilts heavily in favor of the Union. Many portray India to be as imperfectly federal system, or some say that we are a quasi-federal country even today. But this is not acceptable primarily because of the fact that though it is well established that the Indian Constitution gives the Union government more powers than it gives to the states, but it does not clearly establish the supremacy of the Union, as we can see that there are many areas where the center and the states cooperate and coordinate with each other in order to maintain a healthy balance within the Indian federal system. Thank you.